The fluorescent lights of Seattle General's maternity ward hummed overhead as Tobias Evans stood frozen in the doorway, his entire world reduced to the sound of a newborn's cry. His hands that had signed billion-dollar deals without a tremor, hands that had built a tech empire through sheer calculated will, were shaking uncontrollably as the nurse placed 8 pounds of pure innocence into his arms. "She's absolutely perfect," the nurse whispered, her voice soft with the reverence reserved for new life as she adjusted the pink blanket around his daughter's tiny, wrinkled face. But Tobias couldn't speak. He couldn't even breathe. This wasn't supposed to happen. None of this was supposed to happen. The baby's eyes opened, dark and trusting, impossibly wise for someone who had existed in this world for less than an hour, and looked directly at him. In that moment, the ruthless CEO who had controlled every aspect of his 34 years felt his carefully constructed walls crumble into dust. A single tear traced down his cheek, then another, as he whispered in a voice barely audible above the gentle beeping of monitors, "How did you do this to me, little one? How did you and your mother turn my whole world completely upside down?" From across the private room, Alexis Jackson watched the man who had once offered her $5 million to carry his child with no emotional strings attached. The same man who had built his fortune on cold calculation and strategic emotional distance. The same man who was now weeping openly as he held their daughter, transformed by a love he never saw coming and had spent months fighting with every fiber of his being. But let me take you back to where this impossible story began, because what you're about to discover will remind you that sometimes the most powerful force in the universe isn't money or control, it's the courage to let someone see your heart when you've spent a lifetime building walls to hide it from the world. How does a man who trusts no one end up surrendering everything? How does a woman who's been overlooked her entire life become the center of a billionaire's universe? And what happens when a contract meant to keep hearts safe becomes the very thing that tears down every defense two people have ever built? If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and join our Dear Love Diaries family. Your special place in this community of heartfelt stories is waiting for you. These passionate journeys of souls connecting against all odds have brought together thousands of beautiful hearts just like yours. Make sure you hit the bell too, so you'll know immediately when a new story unfolds in our diary of love. This story begins with a revelation that would shock everyone who knew Tobias Evans. The man who had never let emotion cloud a business decision, who had fired executives for showing weakness, who had built an empire on the philosophy that feelings were liabilities, this man was about to discover that some contracts can't contain the human heart. It was over a year earlier when destiny first crossed their paths at Seattle General's annual charity gala. Tobias stood in his perfectly tailored Armani tuxedo, surrounded by the city's elite, writing a check for $2 million with the same casual indifference he might show when ordering his morning coffee. To him, charity was a tax write-off, a carefully calculated move for his public image, nothing more. "Another generous donation from our city's most eligible bachelor," announced his mother, Mariah Evans, her diamond earrings catching the crystal chandelier light as she smiled for the cameras positioned strategically around the hospital's main lobby. Tobias has always believed in giving back to those less fortunate. Less fortunate. The words hung in the air like expensive perfume masking something unpleasant underneath. Tobias mechanically shook hands with board members and posed for photographs, his gray eyes calculating and distant, scanning the crowd for potential business connections rather than seeing the faces of people whose lives his money might actually change. These people were numbers on a tax form, nothing more. "These charity cases should be grateful," he murmured to his business associate, James Morrison, who served as his chief financial officer and closest advisor. Tobias relied on James for numbers and strategy, unlike his competitor Jude Walker who was always looking for ways to undermine his empire. As they observed families in the children's wing through the hospital's floor-to-ceiling glass walls, Tobias continued, "At least they're getting top-tier medical care they could never afford otherwise." That's when he heard her voice, soft but firm, cutting through the polite chatter like a blade through silk. "Charity cases?" The words carried a weight that made every conversation in their vicinity pause. Tobias turned, and his world shifted on its axis. Chapter 2. Tobias turned to find himself face to face with a woman whose presence seemed to shift the very air around him. Alexis Jackson stood barely 5 feet 6 inches, but something in her posture, the straight line of her shoulders, the slight lift of her chin, made her seem to tower over the room filled with Seattle's most powerful people. Her dark skin glowed under the warm lighting of the hospital's main lobby, and her hair was pulled back in a simple bun that revealed the elegant curve of her neck. She wore a simple black dress that had clearly come from a department store rather than a designer boutique, but she carried herself with a dignity that made every socialite in the room look overdressed and artificial. "Excuse me?" Tobias responded, his eyebrows rising slightly. He wasn't accustomed to being challenged, especially not by someone he didn't recognize from Seattle's elite social circles. His gray eyes narrowed as he took in her appearance, trying to place her in the careful hierarchy of wealth and status that governed his world. "You called the children in this hospital charity cases," Alexis said, her amber-brown eyes meeting his gray ones without flinching. There was fire in her gaze, controlled but unmistakable. "I'm wondering if you've ever actually met one of these so-called cases, or if they're just numbers on a tax form to you." The conversations around them had stopped entirely now. Board members, donors, and hospital staff turned to watch this unprecedented confrontation. Mariah Evans's smile became strained as she recognized a potential public relations disaster unfolding in front of the cameras. But Tobias found himself oddly captivated by this woman's audacity. "And you are?" he asked, his voice carrying the cold authority that had built his empire. "Alexis Jackson," she replied without hesitation. "I'm a pediatric nurse here, and I spend every day with those children you dismiss so easily. Would you like to know their names? Their stories? Or would that interfere with your comfortable distance from the people your money is supposed to help?" Something electric passed between them when she said her name, a current that neither had expected. Tobias felt his pulse quicken, though he couldn't understand why. This woman represented everything he typically avoided: emotional investment, messy complications, people who couldn't be controlled or bought. Yet he found himself leaning slightly forward, drawn by the passion in her voice and the unwavering strength in her stance. "Miss Jackson," he said, and even he could hear how his voice had subtly changed, becoming less imperious and more genuinely curious. "I donate millions to this hospital every year. I think that speaks to my commitment to helping these children." "Money is easy when you have billions," Alexis countered, taking a step closer to him. The movement brought with it a subtle scent, something clean and warm, like vanilla and sunshine, completely unlike the heavy designer perfumes that usually surrounded him. "What's hard is caring. What's hard is seeing 7-year-old Maya Rodriguez trying to be brave while her mother cries because she can't afford the surgery that might save her daughter's life. What's hard is watching 12-year-old David Chen pretend he's not scared when he goes into his 5th surgery this year." As she spoke, Tobias found himself genuinely listening, not calculating the conversation's potential impact on his image or looking for ways to end it, but actually hearing her words. When she mentioned the children by name, something shifted in his chest, an uncomfortable tightness he hadn't felt in years. "You know all their names," he said, and it wasn't a question. "Every single one," Alexis replied softly, and for the first time, her fierce expression gentled slightly. "Because they're not charity cases, Mr. Evans. They're brave little souls fighting battles that would break most adults. They deserve to be seen as individuals, not as tax deductions." The moment stretched between them, filled with an awareness that surprised them both. Tobias realized he was studying her face, the way her eyes softened when she spoke about the children, the slight tremor in her voice that revealed how deeply she cared, the absence of any calculation or agenda in her expression. She wasn't trying to impress him or gain something from him. She was simply defending people she loved. "You're right," he heard himself say, and the admission shocked him as much as it did everyone listening. "I should know their names." Alexis blinked, clearly not having expected that response. For a moment, her careful composure wavered, and he caught a glimpse of surprise and something else, hope, perhaps, or recognition that maybe she had misjudged him too. It was then that fate intervened in the form of a server carrying a tray of champagne glasses. The young man, clearly nervous about serving at such an upscale event, stumbled slightly as he passed between them. Alexis reached out instinctively to steady the tray, and Tobias moved at the same moment to prevent the glasses from falling. Their hands collided around the crystal stem of a champagne flute. The contact lasted no more than 3 seconds, but it was as if lightning had struck the hospital lobby. Tobias felt the warmth of her skin, the slight calluses on her fingers that spoke of hard work and dedication, the gentle strength in her grip. Alexis felt the smoothness of his hands, the unexpected gentleness in his touch, the way his fingers lingered against hers for just a moment longer than necessary. When they pulled apart, both were breathing slightly faster. The champagne glass remained safely on the tray, but something far more fragile had been shattered. The careful emotional distance they both maintained from the world. "I'm sorry," the server mumbled, rushing away with his tray, oblivious to the seismic shift he had just caused. "No harm done," Tobias said, but his voice was rougher than usual. He was staring at Alexis with an intensity that made her cheeks warm. "I should get back to work," Alexis said, though she made no move to leave. "My shift starts in an hour." "You work nights?" he asked, genuinely curious rather than making polite conversation. 3 jobs, she admitted, then seemed surprised that she had shared that information with him. Days at the pediatric ward, evenings at a clinic in Beacon Hill, and weekends at a nursing home. "My family, we have expenses." Something in the way she said it, proud but not apologetic, matter-of-fact but not bitter, told Tobias there was a story there. He found himself wanting to know more, wanting to understand what drove this woman who worked 3 jobs yet still had energy to fight for children who weren't even her own. "Miss Jackson," he said, then paused, unsure of what he actually wanted to say. In that pause, Mariah Evans appeared at his elbow like a perfectly timed intervention. "Tobias, darling, the photographers are waiting for the presentation ceremony," his mother said smoothly, her smile bright and completely artificial. Her eyes, however, were calculating as they assessed Alexis from head to toe, clearly finding her wanting. "We mustn't keep the board waiting." The spell was broken. Alexis stepped back, her professional mask sliding back into place, though Tobias could see the warmth in her eyes had been replaced by something more guarded. "Of course," Alexis said politely. "Congratulations on your generous donation, Mr. Evans. I'm sure the children will benefit greatly from your contribution." But as she turned to walk away, Tobias found himself taking a step forward. "Miss Jackson," he called after her. She turned back, one eyebrow raised in question. "Perhaps you could show me around the pediatric ward sometime," he said, ignoring his mother's sharp intake of breath beside him. "I'd like to meet Maya and David. And the others." For the first time since their conversation began, Alexis smiled. A genuine, radiant expression that transformed her entire face and sent another jolt of electricity straight through Tobias's carefully controlled world. "I'd like that, Mr. Evans," she said. "I think you might surprise yourself." As she walked away, her black dress disappearing into the crowd of medical staff returning to their duties, Tobias remained frozen in place, watching until she was completely out of sight. "Tobias," his mother's voice was sharp with warning, "what exactly do you think you're doing?" But Tobias couldn't answer, because he honestly had no idea. All he knew was that Alexis Jackson had challenged everything he thought he knew about himself, and for the first time in years, he felt truly awake. Drop a heart emoji if you've ever felt that instant connection with someone you knew you shouldn't be drawn to. And tell us in the comments about a time when your heart and your head were at complete war with each other. 3 weeks later, Tobias would find himself standing in that same hospital lobby, but for very different reasons. And by then, he would discover that some battles between heart and head can only end one way, with complete and total surrender. Chapter 3. 3 weeks after the charity gala, Tobias Evans found himself doing something he had never done in his 34 years of life, standing in a hospital elevator at 7:30 on a Tuesday evening, carrying a bouquet of flowers and questioning every decision that had led him to this moment. He had visited the pediatric ward twice since the gala, true to his word. The first visit had been a carefully orchestrated photo opportunity with James Morrison and the hospital's board of directors. But the second visit had been different. He had come alone, quietly, and Alexis had introduced him to Maya Rodriguez and David Chen, the children she had mentioned by name. Maya, 7 years old with enormous dark eyes, had shyly shown him her drawings of butterflies. David, 12 and trying so hard to be brave, had explained his condition with the serious demeanor of someone far too young to carry such knowledge. And Tobias had found himself genuinely moved by their courage, their hope, their incredible resilience in the face of circumstances that would have broken him at their age. More importantly, he had watched Alexis with them. The way she remembered every detail of their lives, how she made each child feel like the most important person in the world, the gentle strength she brought to their darkest moments. He had seen her true calling, and it had humbled him in ways he didn't fully understand. Now he was back again, ostensibly to check on Maya's surgery results, but truthfully because he couldn't stop thinking about the woman who had challenged him to see beyond his own carefully constructed walls. The elevator doors closed with their familiar soft chime, and Tobias pressed the button for the 5th-floor pediatric ward. The hospital was quieter in the evening, the daytime bustle replaced by the gentle efficiency of night shifts. He checked his watch, 7:35 p.m. Alexis would be starting her evening round soon, before heading to her second job at the clinic in Beacon Hill. He had done research on her, though he told himself it was simply due diligence. Alexis Marie Jackson, 28 years old, graduated nursing school summa cum laude while working full-time to support her family. Her parents had died in a car accident when she was 20, leaving her to raise her younger twin siblings while caring for her diabetic grandmother. She had never married, had no significant relationships on record, and devoted every waking hour to either her family or her patients. The more he learned about her, the more he realized how completely different their worlds were, and how much that difference intrigued rather than deterred him. The elevator lurched suddenly, a grinding mechanical sound filling the small space. The lights flickered once, twice, then went out completely, leaving Tobias in absolute darkness as the elevator shuddered to a complete stop between floors. Emergency lighting should have kicked in immediately. When it didn't, Tobias felt the familiar tightness beginning in his chest, the claustrophobia that had plagued him since childhood, since the day his grief-stricken mother had locked him in a closet for hours as punishment for crying about his father's death. He pressed the emergency button repeatedly, but there was no response. The silence was deafening, broken only by his increasingly rapid breathing and the sound of his heartbeat thundering in his ears. The walls seemed to be closing in, the air growing thinner with each passing second. "Help," he called out, though his voice came out as barely more than a whisper. "Is anyone there?" That's when he heard footsteps in the hallway outside, and a voice that immediately sent relief flooding through his system. "Hello? Is someone in there?" It was Alexis, and she sounded concerned but calm. "The power's out on this whole section. Are you okay?" Tobias tried to speak, but his throat felt constricted. The panic was building now, memories of that closet mixing with the present reality of being trapped in another small, dark space. "Sir, I need you to answer me," Alexis said, and he could hear her moving closer to the elevator doors. "Are you hurt? Are you having trouble breathing?" "I can't," he managed to say, his voice breaking. "I can't breathe." There was a moment of silence, then Alexis's voice came again, but this time it was different, softer, more intimate, the way she spoke to frightened children. "Listen to my voice," she said, and somehow her tone cut through his rising panic. "You're going to be okay. I'm right here with you, and I'm not going anywhere. What's your name?" Tobias, he whispered, sliding down the wall to sit on the elevator floor, his expensive suit forgotten. Tobias Evans. He heard her sharp intake of breath as she recognized his name, but her voice remained steady and soothing. Okay, Tobias. I'm Alexis, and I want you to focus on my voice. You're having a panic attack, but you're safe. The elevator is secure, and the emergency crews are already on their way. Can you tell me what's triggering this? In the darkness, with his defenses stripped away by fear, Tobias found himself telling her things he had never told anyone. About his father's sudden death from a heart attack when Tobias was 12. About his mother's emotional breakdown and the way she had blamed him for not being strong enough, for crying when he should have been supporting her. About the hours spent locked in that closet, learning that showing weakness only led to more pain. I was 12, he said, his voice barely audible. She said I needed to learn to be a man, that my father's weakness had killed him and I couldn't be weak too. Oh, Tobias, Alexis whispered, and he could hear the compassion in her voice. I'm so sorry. But listen to me, you're not 12 anymore. You're not trapped in that closet. You're a strong, successful man who has overcome incredible trauma, and right now, you're going to overcome this too. I can't see anything, he said, and he hated how vulnerable he sounded. Then let's focus on what you can feel, Alexis replied. Can you feel the wall behind your back? It's solid and supportive. Can you feel the floor beneath you? It's steady and secure. Now, can you feel the air moving? There's plenty of oxygen in there, and the ventilation system is still working. As she spoke, Tobias began to follow her guidance, focusing on the physical sensations rather than his spiraling thoughts. His breathing slowly began to even out. That's good, Alexis said encouragingly. Now I want you to press your hand against the door where you think my voice is coming from. Tobias felt along the wall until he found the seam of the elevator doors. He pressed his palm against the cold metal. Perfect, Alexis said, and he could tell she was directly on the other side. Now I'm going to put my hand right where yours is. We're connected, Tobias. You're not alone. Even though there was a steel door between them, the knowledge that she was there, that her hand was just inches from his, sent a warmth through his chest that had nothing to do with panic and everything to do with connection. Tell me about something good, Alexis said softly. Tell me about a place where you feel completely safe. Tobias found himself talking about his sister Karen's lake house, where he went when the pressure of his empire became too much. He described the sunrise over the water, the sound of loons calling in the early morning, the peace he found in that one place where he didn't have to be Tobias Evans, billionaire CEO. As he spoke, his breathing returned to normal, and the crushing weight on his chest began to lift. But more than that, he realized he was sharing parts of himself with this woman that he had never shared with anyone, not even Karen. The power's coming back on, Alexis said as they heard machinery humming to life around them. But before it does, I want you to know that what you shared with me, that took incredible courage. You're stronger than you think, Tobias Evans. The elevator lights flickered on, and the car lurched gently upward before settling at the 5th floor with a soft chime. As the doors opened, Tobias found himself face to face with Alexis, who was still wearing her scrubs from the day shift, her hand pressed against the outside of the door exactly where his had been. For a moment, neither of them moved. The connection that had formed in the darkness felt fragile in the fluorescent hospital lighting, but undeniably real. Thank you, Tobias said, standing slowly, his legs still slightly unsteady. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been here. Alexis studied his face, and he saw something new in her amber eyes, not the professional distance she had maintained during his previous visits, but genuine concern and something deeper. Everyone needs someone to help them through the dark sometimes, she said softly. Then, after a moment's hesitation, she reached out and touched his arm gently. Are you going to be okay? The touch was brief, professional, but it sent electricity racing through Tobias's entire body. Not the panic he had just experienced, but something warm and alive and completely unexpected. "I am now," he said, and meant it more than he had meant anything in years. As Alexis walked away to continue her rounds, Tobias remained standing in the elevator doorway, watching her disappear around the corner. Something fundamental had shifted between them in that dark elevator, something that couldn't be undone or ignored. For the first time since his father's death, Tobias Evans had allowed someone to see him completely vulnerable. And instead of using that vulnerability against him, Alexis Jackson had simply held space for his fear and helped him find his way back to the light. He had no idea that this moment of connection would become the foundation for everything that was about to change in both their lives. Chapter 4. The elevator incident changed everything, though neither Tobias nor Alexis was willing to admit it at first. In the days that followed, Tobias found himself returning to Seattle General with increasing frequency. At first, he told himself it was business, checking on the hospital's new equipment purchases, meeting with board members about expansion plans, ensuring his donations were being properly utilized. But James Morrison, his usually diplomatic CFO, finally called him out after the 5th visit in 2 weeks. "Boss," James said as they left another unnecessarily long meeting with the hospital administrators, "I've been managing your schedule for 3 years, and you've never shown this much interest in any single charitable investment. What's really going on?" Tobias paused in the hospital lobby, his gray eyes unconsciously scanning the area for a familiar figure in scrubs. "I'm being thorough," he said curtly. "Due diligence." Due diligence doesn't usually involve asking specifically about pediatric nursing schedules, James replied with a knowing look. "You want to tell me about her?" But Tobias couldn't explain what he didn't understand himself. All he knew was that Alexis Jackson had seen him at his most vulnerable and hadn't looked away in disgust or pity. Instead, she had simply held space for his fear and helped him find his strength again. It was a kindness he had never experienced, and it had left him hungry for more of her presence. The next Tuesday evening, exactly 1 week after the elevator incident, Tobias found himself in the pediatric ward during visiting hours. He told himself he was checking on Maya Rodriguez, whose surgery had been successful thanks to an anonymous donation that had mysteriously appeared in her family's account, a donation that certainly had nothing to do with him. "Mr. Evans?" Maya's voice was stronger now, though she was still pale from her recent operation. "You came back." "I promised I would," Tobias said, settling into the chair beside her bed with an ease that surprised him. A month ago, he wouldn't have known how to talk to a child. Now, he found himself genuinely interested in Maya's drawings, her stories about her stuffed butterfly collection, her dreams of becoming a doctor when she grew up. "Nurse Alexis said you helped make my surgery happen," Maya said with the directness that only children possess. "She said sometimes angels come in fancy suits." Tobias felt heat rise in his cheeks. "She said that?" "She says lots of nice things about you," Maya continued innocently. "She said you have a good heart that's just been hiding for a while." Before Tobias could respond, Alexis appeared in the doorway, carrying a tray of medications for her evening rounds. She wore fresh scrubs. Light blue this time, and her hair was pulled back in a ponytail that made her look younger than her 28 years. "Maya, you're supposed to be resting," Alexis said gently, but her eyes met Tobias's over the little girl's head, and he saw warmth there that hadn't been present during their first encounters. "I'm not tired," Maya protested. "Mr. Evans was telling me about his sister's lake house. It sounds like paradise." "Your sister has a lake house?" Alexis asked, and Tobias noticed she moved closer to Maya's bed, close enough that he caught that same clean, warm scent that had distracted him during their first meeting. "In the San Juan Islands," Tobias replied. "Karen bought it after she finished her residency. She says it's the only place where she can completely disconnect from the world." "That sounds wonderful," Alexis said wistfully. "I can't remember the last time I disconnected from anything." There was something in her tone. Exhaustion masked by determination, that made Tobias look at her more carefully. She had faint shadows under her eyes, and he noticed how she unconsciously rubbed her lower back as she stood. "Maya, sweetheart, you need to take your evening medication," Alexis said, returning her attention to her patient. "And then Mr. Evans needs to let you get some sleep." As Alexis administered Maya's medication with the gentle efficiency Tobias had come to associate with her, he found himself studying her movements. Everything she did was purposeful, caring, focused entirely on her patient's comfort and well-being. He had never met anyone so completely dedicated to others. "I'll see you tomorrow, Maya," Tobias said, standing to leave. "You're coming back tomorrow?" Maya asked excitedly. "If that's okay with Nurse Alexis," Tobias said, looking directly at Alexis as he spoke. "I think Maya would like that very much," Alexis replied, and though her words were professional, her smile was personal, soft and genuine in a way that made his chest tighten. As they walked out of Maya's room together, Alexis said quietly, "You don't have to keep coming back, you know. Maya's going to be fine now. What if I'm not coming back just for Maya?" Tobias asked, then immediately wondered where that honesty had come from. Alexis stopped walking and turned to face him in the hallway. For a moment, they stood there surrounded by the gentle chaos of the hospital's evening shift, nurses checking on patients, families visiting loved ones, the soft beeping of monitors creating a constant background rhythm. "Mr. Evans," she began. "Tobias," he corrected. "After last week, I think we can use first names." "Tobias," she said, and hearing his name in her voice sent an unexpected warmth through him. "I think you should know that I looked you up after the gala." "And what did you find?" he asked, though he suspected he knew. "That you're brilliant," she said simply. "That you built your entire empire from nothing after your father died. That you've revolutionized tech integration in healthcare systems across the country. That you're respected and feared in equal measure." She paused, studying his face. "But what I didn't find was any evidence of the man I met in that elevator." "Maybe that man doesn't exist outside of elevators," Tobias said, attempting lightness. "Or maybe," Alexis said softly, "he just hasn't had a reason to exist anywhere else." Before Tobias could respond, Alexis's phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced at it and sighed. "Problem?" he asked. "My brother Anthony," she said, sliding the phone back into her pocket. "He's working late again on a construction site, and his back is bothering him. He's too stubborn to see a doctor, but too proud to admit he needs help." "What kind of construction?" Tobias found himself asking. "Commercial renovation. He's a foreman for Patterson Construction, but they've been understaffed lately, so he's been doing the work of 3 people. Alexis rubbed her temples tiredly. "I should get going. I need to pick up some pain medication for him before my shift at the clinic starts." Tobias watched her gather her things, noting the way she moved with practiced efficiency even when exhausted. 3 jobs, a family to support, patients who depended on her. When did this woman ever rest? "Alexis," he said impulsively. "Would you like to have coffee sometime? When you're not working?" She paused in the middle of putting on her jacket. "When I'm not working?" "It was just a thought," Tobias said quickly, suddenly feeling foolish. "I realize you're busy." "No, it's not that," Alexis interrupted. "It's just, when exactly do you think that would be? I work here 7 days a week from 6 a.m. to 2 p.m., then at the clinic from 4 to 10 p.m. Monday through Friday, and weekends at the nursing home." The reality of her schedule hit Tobias like a physical blow. "When do you sleep?" "When I can," she said with a tired smile. "Usually between 11 p.m. and 5:30 a.m., when I'm lucky." "That's not sustainable," Tobias said, and he could hear the concern in his own voice. "You're going to burn out." "I'll burn out when my grandmother's medical bills are paid off and my siblings finish college," Alexis replied matter-of-factly. "Until then, I do what needs to be done." There it was again, that fierce dedication to others that both humbled and amazed him. But now he also saw the cost of that dedication written in the exhaustion around her eyes, the slight tremor in her hands from too much caffeine and too little sleep. "What if I brought coffee to you instead?" Tobias heard himself suggest. "During your break between shifts. Nothing formal, just coffee." Alexis studied his face for a long moment, and he found himself holding his breath while waiting for her answer. "Why?" she asked finally. "Because," Tobias said, and then stopped, unsure how to explain something he didn't fully understand himself. "Because in that elevator, you made me feel less alone than I've felt in 20 years. And I'd like to return the favor." Something shifted in Alexis's expression, surprise, maybe, or recognition of his sincerity. "Thursday," she said finally. "I have a 15-minute break between shifts on Thursday. There's a small cafe across the street from the clinic." "Thursday," Tobias agreed, feeling something that might have been happiness unfurling in his chest. "What time?" 3:45 p.m. "But Tobias," she added, her voice gentle but serious, "I need you to understand something. I'm not looking for anything complicated. My life is already more complex than I can handle most days." "Just coffee," Tobias promised, though even as he said it, he suspected they both knew it would never be just coffee between them. As Alexis walked away toward the hospital's side exit, her reflection disappearing in the glass doors, Tobias remained standing in the hallway, already counting the hours until Thursday at 3:45 p.m. For the first time in his adult life, Tobias Evans was looking forward to something that had nothing to do with business, profit margins, or strategic advantage. He was looking forward to 15 minutes with a woman who worked 3 jobs and still found energy to fight for other people's children. He had no idea that those 15 minutes would change the entire trajectory of both their lives. Thursday couldn't come fast enough. Chapter 5. Thursday at 3:45 p.m. came faster than Tobias had expected, yet somehow not fast enough. He arrived at the small cafe across from the Beacon Hill Clinic 10 minutes early, choosing a corner table where he could watch for Alexis through the window. He had changed clothes 3 times that morning, finally settling on dark jeans and a simple button-down shirt, the most casual outfit he had worn in public in years. When Alexis appeared in the doorway at exactly 3:45, still in her scrubs from the hospital shift, Tobias felt that now familiar electricity course through him. She looked tired but beautiful, her hair escaping from its ponytail in soft curls that framed her face. "I wasn't sure you'd actually come," she said, sliding into the chair across from him. "I said I would," Tobias replied, signaling the waitress. "What can I get you?" "Just coffee, black," Alexis said, then seemed to reconsider. "Actually, make it a latte. I think I need the extra comfort today." Over the next 15 minutes, they talked about everything and nothing. Alexis told him about her morning with the pediatric patients, how Maya was recovering beautifully and already talking about becoming a doctor. Tobias found himself sharing stories about his sister Karen's medical school experiences, surprised by how easy it was to talk to Alexis when they weren't surrounded by the formal atmosphere of the hospital. "You should bring her by sometime," Alexis said, stirring her latte. "Karen, I mean. Maya would love to meet a real doctor who isn't trying to poke her with needles." "I'd like that," Tobias said, and meant it. The idea of introducing Alexis to his sister, of bringing these 2 parts of his life together, felt natural in a way that should have terrified him but didn't. Their 15 minutes passed like 5, and as Alexis prepared to leave for her clinic shift, Tobias found himself asking, "Same time next week?" "I'd like that," Alexis replied, and her smile was warm and genuine. But as she walked toward the clinic, Tobias's phone buzzed with a text from James Morrison, "Emergency board meeting. Jude Walker's making his move. Get here now." The transition from the warm cafe to the cold steel and glass of Evans Industries boardroom felt like stepping into another world. Tobias straightened his shoulders and slipped back into his CEO persona, but something had fundamentally shifted. The ruthless focus that had once come so naturally now felt like putting on ill-fitting clothes. "Gentlemen," Jude Walker said as Tobias entered the boardroom, his smile sharp and predatory. "So good of you to join us, Tobias. I hope we're not interrupting anything important." Jude Walker had been Tobias's rival since their Harvard Business School days, always 2 steps behind but never quite giving up. Now, as a successful venture capitalist with his own tech empire, he had been circling Evans Industries like a shark, waiting for any sign of weakness. "What's this about, Jude?" Tobias asked, taking his seat at the head of the polished mahogany table. Around him sat the 12 members of his board of directors, their faces carefully neutral but their tension palpable. "It's about your recent distraction," Jude replied, sliding a tablet across the table. On the screen was a series of photographs: Tobias entering the hospital, Tobias talking to Alexis in the hallway, Tobias leaving the cafe just an hour earlier. "Your frequent visits to Seattle General, your newfound interest in pediatric nursing, your coffee dates with hospital staff. The board is concerned about your focus on company matters." Tobias felt ice forming in his veins. "You've been having me followed?" "Due diligence," Jude said with a shrug. "The board asked me to investigate some concerning patterns in your behavior. Late arrivals to meetings, cancelled appointments, strategic decisions that seem emotionally influenced rather than logically sound." "My personal life is not board business," Tobias said, his voice dangerously quiet. "It is when it affects company performance," interjected Harold Barnes, the board's longest-serving member. "Tobias, we've watched you build this company from nothing. But lately, your judgment seems compromised." "In what way?" Tobias demanded. "The Patterson construction deal," Jude said smoothly. "You gave them a contract worth twice what any other company bid. Patterson happens to employ one Anthony Jackson, brother of your new friend, the nurse." The blood drained from Tobias's face. He had indeed steered the hospital's construction contract to Patterson Construction, telling himself it was because they were a quality local company. But the truth was, he had wanted to help Anthony Jackson, to ease some of the burden on Alexis's family without her knowing. "That's good business," Tobias said, but his voice lacked conviction. "That's emotional decision-making," Jude corrected. "The kind that costs shareholders money and makes boards nervous. Which brings me to my proposal." Jude stood and walked to the window overlooking Seattle's skyline, his reflection ghost-like in the glass. "I'm prepared to make an offer for Evans Industries. A generous one. But it comes with conditions." "I'm not selling," Tobias said immediately. "Even to prevent a hostile takeover?" Jude asked, turning back to face him. "Because that's what this is, Tobias. I have backing from 3 major investment firms, and I've been quietly acquiring shares for months. I now control 35% of your company." The room fell silent except for the sound of Seattle traffic far below. Tobias felt the familiar tightness in his chest, but this time it wasn't claustrophobia, it was rage. "What do you want?" he asked. "Simple," Jude replied. "End this inappropriate relationship with the nurse. Immediately. Focus on the company. And marry someone suitable from our social circle, someone who enhances your image rather than damaging it." "You're asking me to control my personal life for business purposes." "I'm asking you to remember who you are," Jude said. "You're Tobias Evans, billionaire CEO. You don't date hospital staff. You don't make business decisions based on personal feelings. You certainly don't risk everything you've built for someone who comes from a completely different world." Before Tobias could respond, his phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "If you want to see Anthony Jackson keep his job, the nurse needs to stay away from you. Some people don't belong in your world." "Did you threaten her brother?" Tobias asked, his voice deadly quiet. "I made it clear that certain associations might be problematic for his employment," Jude replied casually. Construction is a small industry in Seattle. Word travels fast about workers whose families cause complications for their employers. That was it. The final straw. Tobias stood so quickly his chair fell backward, crashing to the floor. Get out. Tobias, Harold Barnes began. All of you, get out, Tobias repeated, his gray eyes blazing. This meeting is over. You have 24 hours to think about my offer, Jude said, gathering his papers. After that, I file for the hostile takeover, and this gets very public, very messy. Your nurse friend won't just lose her brother's job, she'll lose her reputation, her career, everything. The media will make her life a living hell. After the board members filed out, Tobias remained alone in the conference room, staring at his reflection in the dark window. Everything he had built, everything he had worked for, was being held hostage. But more than that, Alexis, innocent, hardworking Alexis, was being threatened because of him. His phone rang. Karen. Tobias, I just got a call from Mother, his sister said without preamble. She's heard about some nurse you've been seeing. She's flying back from Europe tomorrow. How does she know? Tobias asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Jude Walker called her. Tobias, what's going on? Mother sounded, well, you know how she gets when she thinks you're making emotional decisions. Tobias closed his eyes, remembering his mother's reaction to his father's death, the way she had blamed emotion for weakness, the way she had tried to teach him that feelings were liabilities that destroyed men. I have to go, he said. Tobias, wait, but he had already hung up. Standing alone in the boardroom where he had made millions of dollars in deals, where he had built an empire through pure force of will, Tobias Evans faced the hardest decision of his life. He could fight for his company, fight for his legacy, fight for everything he had built. But doing so would destroy an innocent woman who had shown him nothing but kindness, who had helped him through his darkest moment, who had made him feel human again for the first time in 20 years. Or he could surrender everything he had worked for to protect her. As he stood there, watching the Seattle skyline disappear into darkness, Tobias realized that the choice had already been made. The moment Alexis had touched his hand in that elevator, the moment she had seen his vulnerability and hadn't turned away, the moment she had smiled at him over coffee and made him want to be better than he was, that was the moment his empire had stopped being the most important thing in his life. Have you ever been in a situation where doing what seemed right for others felt completely wrong for your heart? Share your story in the comments. Sometimes the hardest choices teach us the most about our own strength and what we truly value. The next morning, Tobias Evans would do something unprecedented. He would walk into Seattle General Hospital and offer Alexis Jackson a contract that would change both their lives forever. But first, he had to survive a conversation with his mother that would test every wall he had rebuilt around his heart. The war for his soul was about to begin, and for the first time in his life, Tobias wasn't sure he wanted to win it. Chapter 6. The next morning brought the kind of Seattle storm that seemed to mirror the chaos in Tobias's soul. Rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse as he sat in his home office, staring at the legal documents James Morrison had prepared through the night. The contract was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its implications. A surrogacy agreement that would solve all his problems while potentially destroying the one thing that had begun to matter more than his empire. His phone buzzed. A text from Alexis, "Thank you for yesterday. The coffee was perfect. See you Thursday." The innocence in her message made his chest ache. She had no idea that their simple coffee dates had triggered a corporate war, that her brother's job hung in the balance, that her entire life was about to be turned upside down because she had dared to show kindness to a man who had forgotten how to be human. "Mr. Evans?" His housekeeper's voice came through the intercom. "Your mother is here." Tobias closed his eyes, steeling himself for the confrontation he had been dreading since Karen's call. "Send her up." Mariah Evans entered his office like a force of nature, her silver hair perfectly styled despite the storm, her designer suit immaculate, her blue eyes, so like his own, blazing with controlled fury. At 58, she was still beautiful, still commanding, still capable of making him feel like the 12-year-old boy who had disappointed her by crying at his father's funeral. "Tobias," she said, her voice carrying the chill of old money and older disappointments. "I came as soon as I heard." "Heard what, mother?" Tobias asked, though he knew exactly what she meant. "About your infatuation with some nurse," Mariah replied, settling into the chair across from his desk as if she owned the place. "Jude Walker was kind enough to call me in Monaco. He's concerned about your judgment." "Jude Walker is trying to steal my company," Tobias said flatly. "Perhaps because you've given him reason to believe it's poorly managed," Mariah countered. "Tobias, what were you thinking? A pediatric nurse? From a working-class family? Do you have any idea what the media would do with that story?" "Her name is Alexis Jackson," Tobias said quietly. "And she's the most remarkable person I've ever met." "I'm sure she is," Mariah said dismissively. "I'm sure she's very pretty and very sweet and very grateful for your attention. But she's not suitable, Tobias. She's not one of us. What if I don't want to be one of us anymore?" The words came out before Tobias could stop them, and he saw his mother's face freeze. "Don't be ridiculous," Mariah said, her voice sharp. "You are Tobias Evans. You have responsibilities, to the company, to our family name, to the legacy your father died trying to build. Dad died of a heart attack at 42 because he worked himself to death trying to prove he was worthy of your love," Tobias shot back, years of suppressed anger finally breaking free. "Maybe I don't want to follow in his footsteps." Mariah's face went white. "Your father was weak," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "He let his feelings control him, let sentiment cloud his judgment. I won't watch you make the same mistakes." "Feeling something other than ambition isn't weakness, Mother," Tobias said, standing to pace to the window. "It's called being human." "Being human is a luxury you can't afford," Mariah replied, her composure returning. "You have a duty to produce an heir, to continue the Evans line. If you insist on this relationship, then do it properly. Marry someone appropriate, someone who can help your career rather than hinder it." "I'm not marrying anyone for career advancement," Tobias said, but even as he said it, he looked down at the contract on his desk. The surrogacy agreement. The compromise that would give him what he needed while protecting Alexis from the full force of his mother's world. "Then you'll lose everything," Mariah said simply. "Jude Walker has the backing to destroy you, and I won't lift a finger to stop him if you continue down this path." After his mother left, Tobias sat alone in his office, the storm outside matching the tempest in his heart. He had spent his entire adult life building walls, creating distance, protecting himself from the kind of vulnerability that had destroyed his father. But Alexis had walked through every defense he had constructed, and now he was faced with an impossible choice. At 2 o'clock, he drove to Seattle General, the contract burning like fire in his briefcase. He found Alexis in the children's ward, reading to a group of young patients. She sat cross-legged on the floor, a picture book in her lap, her voice bringing the story to life with different voices for each character. The children were mesmerized, their faces lit with wonder and joy. Watching her, Tobias felt his heart break a little more. "Mr. Evans." Maya called out when she spotted him. "Come listen to the story." "In a moment, sweetheart," Tobias said, his voice hoarse. "I need to speak with Nurse Alexis first." Alexis looked up, and her smile faded when she saw his expression. "Kids, why don't you look at the pictures while I talk to Mr. Evans?" They walked to a quiet corner of the ward, and Tobias struggled to find words for what he needed to say. "You look terrible," Alexis said gently. "What's wrong?" "I need to ask you something," Tobias said, his hands shaking slightly as he reached for his briefcase. And before you answer, I need you to understand that I'm not asking because I want to, but because I have to. Alexis frowned, concern clouding her amber eyes. Tobias, you're scaring me. My company is under attack, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. A hostile takeover. The board thinks I'm distracted, that my judgment is compromised because of you. They're threatening to destroy everything I've built. Because of me? Alexis's voice was small, wounded. Because I care about you, Tobias corrected. Because for the first time in my life, something matters more to me than profit margins and strategic advantage. What are you asking me? Alexis said, though her voice suggested she already feared the answer. Tobias pulled out the contract, his hands trembling as he placed it on the nearby table. I need an heir. Someone to carry on the Evans name, to satisfy the board, to give me the legitimacy I need to fight off this takeover. Alexis stared at the document, her face growing pale as she read the terms. A surrogacy contract? $5 million, Tobias said, hating himself for the words. Complete medical care, financial security for your family. Your brother's medical bills, your grandmother's diabetes treatment, your siblings' college tuition, everything taken care of. You want me to have your baby, Alexis said, her voice hollow. Like a business transaction. I want you to be safe, Tobias said desperately. If we continue seeing each other, they'll destroy you. Your brother will lose his job, your reputation will be ruined, your family will suffer. But if you do this, if you give me a child, I can protect you all. And what about us? Alexis asked, tears beginning to gather in her eyes. What about the coffee dates and the conversations and the way you look at me like I'm the only person in the world? There is no us, Tobias said, the lie tasting like poison in his mouth. There never could be. Our worlds are too different, the obstacles too great. But this way, you get something out of it. Your family gets security. You're reducing me to a womb, Alexis said, her voice breaking. To a biological function. I'm trying to protect you, Tobias said, reaching for her hand, but she pulled away. By treating me like a commodity? Alexis's tears were flowing freely now. By asking me to carry your child and then disappear from your life? It's the only way, Tobias said, his own eyes burning with unshed tears. If I could choose differently, if I could just be a normal man who could love a normal woman without bringing down empires, I would. But I can't. This is who I am, and this is the world I live in. Alexis stared at him for a long moment, her face cycling through hurt, anger, and finally, heartbreaking understanding. You're choosing your empire over your heart. I'm choosing to keep you safe, Tobias said. Same thing, Alexis replied quietly. She picked up the contract, her hands shaking as she read through the terms again. $5 million. It's not about the money, Tobias said desperately. Isn't it? Alexis asked. You're offering me more money than my family will see in 3 generations. You're solving every financial problem we've ever had. And all I have to do is give you a baby and pretend I never fell in love with you. The admission hung between them like a physical presence. Tobias felt his breath catch, his heart hammering against his ribs. Alexis, I need time to think, she said, clutching the contract to her chest. I need to talk to my family. How long? Tobias asked. A week, Alexis said, turning away from him. Give me a week. As she walked away, Tobias remained frozen in the children's ward, surrounded by the gentle sounds of young patients who still believed in happy endings. He had just asked the woman he was falling in love with to bear his child and disappear from his life. It was the most rational, logical, strategically sound decision he had ever made. It was also the most heartbreaking. 7 days later, Alexis Jackson would give him an answer that would change both their lives forever. But first, she had to decide whether love was worth the price of becoming a billionaire's secret. The hardest week of both their lives was about to begin. Chapter 7. The week that followed was the longest of Tobias Evans's life. He threw himself into preparing for Jude Walker's hostile takeover with the same ruthless focus that had built his empire, but his heart wasn't in the fight. Every strategic meeting, every legal maneuver, every defensive play felt hollow without the possibility of Alexis in his future. He didn't return to Seattle General. He didn't text her. He didn't even drive past the hospital on his way to work. But he thought about her constantly, wondered if she was getting enough sleep, if her brother's back was still bothering him, if Maya Rodriguez was still drawing butterflies and dreaming of becoming a doctor. On the 6th day, Karen cornered him in his office. "You look like hell," his sister said, settling into the chair across from his desk with the casual familiarity of someone who had known him his entire life. "I feel like it," Tobias admitted, abandoning any pretense of being fine. "Want to tell me what's really going on?" Karen asked gently. "And don't say it's just business. I know you, Tobias. I've never seen you like this over a corporate takeover." So he told her everything. About the elevator panic attack, the coffee dates, the way Alexis made him feel human again. About Jude's threats, Mother's ultimatum, and the contract that could save his company while destroying his heart. "You offered her a surrogacy contract?" Karen's voice was incredulous. "Tobias, that's not protection, that's emotional torture for both of you." "It's the only way to keep her safe," Tobias said, his voice hollow. "If we continue seeing each other, they'll destroy her. At least this way, she gets something out of it." "And what do you get?" Karen asked. "Besides a baby and a completely broken heart?" "I get to know she's okay," Tobias said simply. "I get to know that her family is secure, that she can focus on her patients without worrying about money, that she won't suffer because she made the mistake of caring about me." Karen stared at him for a long moment. "You're in love with her." "It doesn't matter," Tobias said. "It's the only thing that matters," Karen replied firmly. "Tobias, you've spent your entire adult life building walls around your heart because you were terrified of ending up like Dad. But what if the real tragedy isn't that he died young? What if it's that you've been living without really being alive?" Before Tobias could respond, James Morrison knocked and entered without waiting for permission. "Boss, she's here." Tobias's heart stopped. "Alexis?" "In the lobby," James confirmed. "She asked to see you." Tobias stood so quickly his chair rolled backward. "Send her up." "Actually," James said, "I think you should go down. She seems nervous about coming up to the executive floor." Of course she was. Alexis Jackson, who could handle medical emergencies with perfect calm, who could comfort frightened children and face down intimidating billionaires, was nervous about entering his world because she understood intuitively that it wasn't designed for people like her. Tobias found her in the lobby, looking small and out of place among the marble floors and chrome fixtures. She wore a simple blue dress and carried a manila envelope that he assumed contained the contract. Her face was composed, but he could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she held herself as if prepared for battle. "Alexis," he said, his voice rougher than intended. "Tobias," she replied, and something in her tone made his chest tighten. "Is there somewhere we can talk privately?" He led her to a small conference room off the main lobby, closing the door behind them. For a moment, they stood in silence, the weight of the past week heavy between them. "I signed it," Alexis said finally, placing the envelope on the table. "The contract. I signed it." Tobias felt something die inside him. "Alexis, let me finish," she interrupted. "I signed it because my family needs the security. Because my grandmother's medical bills are crushing us, because Anthony needs surgery he can't afford, because my siblings deserve a chance at college without going into debt that will follow them for decades. I understand, Tobias said quietly. No, you don't, Alexis said, her amber eyes blazing. Because if you understood, you would know that I also signed it because I'm already in love with you, and carrying your child is the closest I'll ever get to having a real future with you. The words hit Tobias like a physical blow. Alexis, don't, I'm not finished, she said, tears beginning to gather in her eyes. I signed your contract because I know you think this is the only way to protect me. But I want you to know that I would have chosen you, Tobias. If you had asked me to face down your mother, your board, the media, the whole world, I would have chosen you. You don't understand what that world would do to you, Tobias said desperately. The scrutiny, the judgment, the way they would tear apart everything about your life, your family, your past, you don't understand what I'm capable of surviving, Alexis countered. I've been taking care of myself and my family since I was 20 years old. I've worked 3 jobs while going to school, held dying children while their parents fell apart, fought insurance companies and hospital administrators and doctors who thought a working-class woman couldn't possibly understand complex medical situations. I'm stronger than you think. I know you are, Tobias said, his voice breaking. That's what makes this so hard. Then why? Alexis asked, stepping closer to him. Why are you choosing your empire over your heart? Because I love you, Tobias said, the words tearing out of him like a physical wound. Because I love you too much to destroy your life for my happiness. The silence that followed was deafening. Alexis stared at him, tears streaming down her face, and Tobias felt his carefully constructed world crumbling around him. You love me, she whispered. I love you, he confirmed, his own tears finally breaking free. I love your strength and your compassion and the way you make me want to be better than I am. I love how you see the best in everyone, how you fight for people who can't fight for themselves, how you make me feel like I'm worth something beyond my bank account. Then choose me, Alexis said, reaching for his hands. Choose us. Choose love over fear. I can't, Tobias said, even as his fingers intertwined with hers. If I do, I'll lose everything. The company, the employees who depend on me, my ability to protect you, you'll lose everything if you don't, Alexis interrupted. Because what's the point of having an empire if you're completely alone in it? 9 months later, Tobias would understand the wisdom of her words. But in that moment, standing in the sterile conference room with the woman he loved begging him to choose happiness over security, he made the only decision he thought he could make. The contract stands, he said, pulling his hands away from hers. We proceed as planned. Alexis nodded, her face crumpling with grief. Then I guess we'd better get started. The conception was successful on the first attempt. Clinical, efficient, everything a business transaction should be. But as Tobias sat in the medical office afterward, listening to the doctor confirm the pregnancy, he felt as if he had just signed his own death warrant. He had gotten everything he wanted. An heir, protection from the takeover, security for Alexis's family. So why did it feel like he had lost everything that mattered? The answer would come 7 months later, during a thunderstorm that would change both their lives forever. But first, they had to survive the impossible task of pretending that carrying his child was just business, when every day brought them closer to admitting that some things are too powerful to be contained by contracts. The hardest part of their journey was just beginning. Chapter 8. 7 months later, on a night when Seattle's autumn storm matched the tempest in both their hearts, Alexis Jackson stood in the lobby of Tobias Evans's penthouse building, soaked to the skin and 7 months pregnant with his child. The contract between them had become a prison, and she could no longer pretend that business arrangements could contain the human heart. When the elevator doors opened to reveal Tobias, disheveled, vulnerable, looking as broken as she felt. Every wall they had built around their feelings crumbled in an instant. I can't do this anymore, she whispered, her hand resting on her rounded belly. I can't pretend that this baby is just a contract, that you're just a client, that I don't love you more than I've ever loved anything in my life. Alexis, he breathed, stepping toward her with trembling hands. I've been dying without you. Every day, watching you from a distance, pretending I don't care, it's been killing me. That night, in his penthouse with storm winds rattling the windows and emergency candles casting dancing shadows, they finally admitted what they had both known from the beginning: some connections are too powerful to be contained by legal documents, some love too fierce to be denied by corporate strategy. 2 months later, as Tobias held their newborn daughter Maya, named for the brave little girl who had brought them together, he understood what Alexis had tried to tell him in that conference room. He had spent his whole life building an empire, but it was meaningless without someone to share it with. She's perfect, he whispered, tears streaming down his face as baby Maya opened her dark eyes and looked directly at him. You're both perfect. 6 months after that, Tobias and Alexis exchanged vows in a small ceremony at Seattle General's Chapel, surrounded by the children from the pediatric ward, their families, and Karen's tears of joy. Maya gurgled contentedly in her mother's arms as her parents promised to love each other through every storm. I was wrong, Tobias said during his vows, looking directly into Alexis's amber eyes. I thought the most ruthless thing I could do was protect my empire. But the most ruthless thing I ever did was allow myself to love you completely, vulnerably, fearlessly. As they kissed, sealing their promise, the children from the ward erupted in cheers. Maya Rodriguez, now 9 and cancer-free, threw flower petals in the air. David Chen, 13 and thriving, declared it the best wedding ever. Sometimes the most powerful force in the universe isn't money or control. It's the courage to let someone see your heart when you've spent a lifetime building walls to protect it. Sometimes the greatest shock isn't what we gain when we love, it's discovering who we become when we allow ourselves to be loved completely in return. What's the bravest thing you've ever done for love? Was there a moment when you had to choose between what felt safe and what felt true to your heart? Share your story below. Your courage might inspire someone else to choose love over fear. Subscribe for tomorrow's story of unexpected love conquering impossible odds. Like if this story reminded you that real strength comes from vulnerability and authentic connection. Comment with your own moments of choosing courage over comfort in matters of the heart. And remember, in a world that often tells us to choose logic over emotion, sometimes the most logical thing you can do is follow your heart home.